Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 265. Now it turns out I made a slight error recording last week's in that I recorded this week's Drydock last week, so you get last week's Drydock this week, except it's different from last week's Drydock because last week's Drydock was this week's Drydock, which isn't last week's Drydock. Yeah, anyway. The questions are taken from Guide 324 and 325, that's the French Océan class, and the Spanish Santissima Trinidad, plus the US tour video on USS Yorktown CV-10, part 2 of the Admiral Cunningham biography, which is ongoing, and then finally a question coming in from the Learn from the library on the Kriegsmarine. So, let's get on with questions. John Lavery asks, I've heard from another history YouTuber, History Buffs, that after the battle with the Spanish Armada, there was a huge outbreak of disease among the English fleet, and Queen Elizabeth kept them in quarantine, not just to avoid spreading plague, but to help, let's say, minimise the number of people that she had to pay. Is this true, and did any similar cases happen to the best of your knowledge? Now, as far as I'm aware, and obviously having done the videos I did recently on the Armada, I've done a fair bit of looking into this. I can't put my finger on any one specific document where Elizabeth's court turns around and says, well, haha, if we let all the sailors die, we don't have to pay them. On the other hand, Elizabeth's court was notoriously tight with money, and so, yes, the English fleet was having a massive outbreak of disease. Standard policy, if you had a bunch of ships that were infected with diseases, was to quarantine them and not allow them on shore, because obviously back in those days you definitely did not want a plague spreading through your population. England had already gone through a number of those, thank you very much, and would actually continue to have outbreaks of plague later on. So the idea of quarantining the ships that were unwell was fairly normal. However, they ordered the entire fleet quarantined when some ships, in fact a fair number of the ships initially, didn't seem to have anybody who was unwell, and they kept them there. And of course, as supplies dwindled and as people communicated between the ships, etc., gradually the disease spread. So the opinion of some of the senior officers, including people like Hawkins and Drake, did eventually start to shift over towards, we think we're being hung out to dry here. So there is a reasonable body of evidence that I'm not necessarily sure Elizabeth I herself made the decision, but certainly I would suspect there is a better chance than not that elements of Queen Elizabeth's court turned around and took the opportunity to minimise their expenditure in terms of crew that they had to pay when the ships came ashore. It's very distasteful, obviously, but I think it's more likely than not. There is a reasonable chance, as in like double-digit percentage chance that that's not the case, but there's a greater one that it probably is. And in terms of other similar cases, yes, keeping an army or a navy out in the field so that it gets decimated by disease and then you don't have to pay them does crop up semi-regularly, more than it should, which, I mean, obviously it should be zero, but, within the scope of human awfulness, it shows up slightly more often than you might think even then. Usually by people who are incredibly short-sighted, because if you have a bunch of, obviously, if they've won, skilled and now battle-hardened soldiers or sailors, if you then go and let them all die, if someone then shows up with hostile intentions, where are you going to get your soldiers and sailors from in order to face off your next threat? So it's extremely short-term thinking, something a modern politician or treasury official might do. As time went on, it did get a little bit harder for large navies like the Royal Navy to be so indisposed, partly because hospitals were set up, you had the Chatham Chest, and also when it came to the Armada, you had pretty much the entirety of England's floating fighting capability out at sea all in one place, whereas, if you tried to pull that trick on, say, the fleet coming back from the Battle of Cape St. Vincent or the fleet coming back from the Battle of Trafalgar or something like that, that only represents a portion of the Royal Navy's fighting power, and if the rest of the Royal Navy gets wind that elements of it are being hung out to dry and die for the sake of somebody's balance sheets, yeah, this is not a scenario you really want to happen if you value your life. But what you might call adjacent predatory behaviours still continued for a surprisingly long time. Even in World War II, in many merchant fleets, your pay was stopped when your ship was sunk. So if you were on a convoy duty and you were in a merchant ship and you got torpedoed and sunk, your company didn't care if you'd spent a week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, or 8 weeks or more in a lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic. You weren't getting paid for any of that time. As far as the company was concerned, their obligation towards you ceased the moment that ship slipped beneath the waves, which, of course, got revised after a fair bit of outcry. Although, again, as with many of these kind of predatory behaviours, the main driver was actually cases like the San Demetrio, where if they managed to claim salvage money, and frankly, a lot of these large corporations and a lot of their political backers couldn't care less if people have hardship of not having money because they were physically disabled by being in a lifeboat in the North Atlantic for 2 months, and then got back to find out not only do they not get paid for those 2 months, but they're not going to get any compensation. But the minute you have to pay out a few tens of thousands of pounds in salvage money to somebody who's actually brought a ship back, oh no, Lord Huffington the 71st won't be able to afford the next gilded duck pond for next season. This can't possibly be true. We must pass laws that will prevent this kind of case from happening again. And if that happens to be a case of, well, you actually should pay your sailors until they get back to port, well, you just have to hold your nose and pay those noxious plebeians, because, Lord Huffington can't be without his luxuries, That would really be bad. Sandro Cerruti asks, I remember a long time ago I saw a brief video of the Royal Navy scuttling a former French vessel captured at Trafalgar after France refused to repurchase it, I think in 1956. Do you have some memory of... Well, it was actually 1949, but otherwise your recollection is pretty much spot on. So this was the former French Duguay Troyen, I think that's how it's pronounced. She was a French 74, third rate, which was then captured after the Battle of Trafalgar, renamed HMS Implacable, and stayed in Royal Navy service for quite some time. After the Second World War, she was found to be in fairly poor condition, and the government decided we wanted to get rid of her. And they first said to the French in 1947, hey, look, we've got one of your old ships, do you want it back? The French government said no. Recovering from being occupied by Nazis tends to do bad things to your budget. And then, after having received a refusal from the French government, the British government decided in its infinite wisdom it was going to commit one of its semi-regular acts of historical vandalism and blow up the Implacable. Specifically, they were going to scuttle it with large amounts of explosives in the Channel. Because, 200 grand for completely restoring the only third-rate ship of the line in existence was clearly too much. For reference, £200,000 back then was the cost of 1/4 of an English electric Canberra. So Britain might have been broke after the Second World War. Britain could have afforded to keep this ship. The government chose not to. Clearly there was some government toady or friend with a private industry who needed a bit of a backhander. And so poor old Implacable was taken out into the Solent and basically summarily executed with the proverbial shot to the back of the head, except that it was screwed up in possibly the single most hilarious way possible. Because, I keep saying you sink a ship by letting water in the bottom instead of air in the top. Okay, well, this much they got right. They put a bunch of explosive charges in the hold to blow out the bottom so that the ship would sink, and against any ship built after about 1860, this would have worked perfectly fine. Unfortunately, as you can tell from this image, the really big heavy stuff up top, like the masts, had all gone. And the really big heavy stuff inside, like the cannon and the anchors, had all gone. The only part of the Implacable at this point that was heavier than water, denser than water, was the pig iron ballast they put in the hold. Everything else was made of wood. And you know what wood does in water, don't you? Yeah, it floats. So what happens when you set off a bunch of explosive charges underneath and inside the hold of a wooden warship whose only heavy elements are in the hold. That's right, all the ballast fell out of the bottom, and the ship refused to sink. I mean, okay, the hold wasn't holding in air anymore, so it did sink a little bit, but despite the fact the ship had essentially been blown in two and was working back and forth like a door on a hinge, the upper deck and a little bit of the upper gun deck stayed afloat. You know, just floating merrily in the Solent for hours, because someone had forgotten that wood floats. At which point, depending on which set of reports you believe, either everybody quietly kept watch until presumably the wood all got waterlogged or something and eventually settled onto the ocean floor, or the sea floor, I guess, in the Solent, or, according to one or two other people who were there, they quietly had to go out there with some tools, you know, hammers and mallets and things and axes, and break it up a bit to encourage it to head back down to the bottom. Because, of course, this is the days of before health and safety, so sending out a bunch of guys with melee weapons to break up a ship you've just basically blown in two in the middle of the ocean when your clear intention is to actually, you know, cause it to sink, well, no one had to write a health and safety risk assessment for that. And, well, surprisingly enough, what's left of Implacable seems to have actually survived on the Solent bed for in reasonably good condition. But with a bottom blown out, and as I said, basically having been blown into two halves, there's precious little, if any, chance or point to salvaging her now. But just imagine, you know, if only some little toady of the whatever current government we had at the time hadn't needed a backhander that week, whilst Britain's naval and maritime heritage in terms of preserved museum ships isn't quite as large and extensive as America's, we do have the only surviving first-rate ship of the line, and we could have had the only surviving third-rate. Mind you, this is the same government that sent Warspite to the breakers, so is this really much of a surprise? The Huskal asks, when a compartmentalised ship is prepared for battle, the crew closes all doors and hatches to help maintain watertight integrity. With everything buttoned up, how do they maintain airflow to keep the boilers running without compromising the integrity of the ship? Essentially, they have dedicated air vents or intakes that run down into the boilers. Now, in old school ships, this is HMS Blenheim in the late 1890s, you can see they're rather obvious. These are these classic kind of forward-pointing horn-like objects scattered all along the deck. And, well, whenever you see them in period films and everything, this is what they take air in, they all go straight down into the boiler rooms. That's your air intake. It doesn't rely on airflow through the rest of the ship to keep the boiler supplied. Now, what you'll notice is that when you get into the First World War, like here with HMS Warrior, they seem to have gotten a lot smaller and a lot fewer, despite the fact the engine power output, and therefore the need for oxygen, has gotten a lot larger. Now, that's partly because they've introduced things like forced draft fans, which can suck down a lot more air for a given amount of intake, but partly because the version of intakes was moving. So if you look at World War I German ship, that was slightly ahead of the curve on this, like this is Yavut Sultan Selim, aka Goeben, you'll notice none. But there are these slightly weird ribbed things around the base of the funnels, and that's because the air intakes had, thanks to the fact they had a lot of suction thanks to the fans, had essentially become grills usually placed around the funnels. And then by the time you get to World War II, essentially almost no ship in World War II has any kind of immediately visible horn-like air intake. They're all these grills mounted on the deck. And if you go and look at museum ships today and you look very carefully, you'll actually find them. So the air supply for the boilers runs there vertically down through the ship into the boiler room, and then obviously the air comes back up again via the funnels. Nay UU3LX asks, if the Spanish did not suffer from the negligent reign of Charles V and Godoy, and they chose not to align with France on grounds of supporting the Bourbon monarchy, could the Spanish have fought the French Republic or Empire on an equal footing at sea? On paper, yes. In practice, maybe. The French and the Spanish would actually both be facing the same problem, which is that they both have Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts, so their fleets would kind of be equally split. However, if the Spanish are fighting the French, then in theory they are at least enemy of my enemy with the English, which would mean they have a little bit easier time of it transiting Gibraltar than a theoretical French fleet would. The Spanish and French navies, certainly by the time of the French Republic, are approximately on a par numbers-wise. And the Spanish ship designs aren't half bad either. But the problem comes about with whether or not the Spanish can actually pay for all of this. So it depends a lot on what changes if the two rulers you mentioned are actually competent. Because the Spanish Empire, it wasn't doing particularly well financially anyway, but the main problem the French had in the Republic and Empire period wasn't that they lacked the ships and the sailors, or the ability to pay for them. It was that they lacked the ability to actually go to sea because there was a massive Royal Navy blockade that kept nicking their ships every time they tried to go out to sea. Hyperbole, but you get the idea. With the Spanish, quite a lot of the time, the Spanish fleet didn't go to sea simply because there wasn't enough money to pay the sailors to actually sail the ships. Which means that even though at times the Spanish fleet actually had more ships than the French, so for example at the time of the Battle of Cape St. Vincent in 1797, the Spanish had almost twice as many first rates and almost a dozen more third rates, i.e. all the ships of the line, than the French Navy did. Now, granted, at that point that was largely thanks to the fact the Royal Navy and French royalist rebels had ensured the destruction and or capture of the bulk of the French fleet in Toulon, but it offered a gap of a few years where, in theory, the Spanish would have a numerical superiority over the French fleet instead of just being roughly on a par. But as I said, does the Spanish treasury have the money to afford to pay the sailors to keep the fleet repaired, in shape, and out at sea regularly enough to be exercised so that they can fight with either equal or better skill than their French counterparts? Because if they don't, then a Spanish ship going up a French ship against a French ship, you might find that the French ship actually has more experience in fighting, whereas if there's more money in the coffers, well, at that point, especially if they're not blockaded by the British, because the British are just like, oh yes, you too can go and fight the French, then they could fight the French with an equal footing, or possibly even a slight edge at sea. Titan asks, if the British had managed to tow Santissima Trinidad into a port and later commission her, would they have left her as she was, or would they have razzied her back down to a more manoeuvrable and thus more feasible first or second rate? Oh, they absolutely would have razzied her. Because bear in mind, when Santissima Trinidad was originally built, she wasn't a weak vessel. She was a pretty powerful first rate in her original state with 3 gun decks. And let's face it, that 4th gun deck was mostly bragging rights. It made the ship horrifically unmanoeuvrable, and it didn't add all that much to her firepower either. The guns up there were really light. So, yeah, if the Royal Navy had managed to bring her back into port after Cape St. Vincent, or even after Trafalgar, I mean, after Trafalgar she probably was in a slightly worse state, but either way, they would have definitely just taken that upper gun deck off and got stuff it. No, we're rearming her as a normal 3-decker. She's still going to be one of our biggest 3-deckers, if not the biggest, at least until the Caledonias come online. And especially if you've been captured at Cape St. Vincent, probably would have had a fairly extensive service history with the Navy. Brendan Boersdorf asks, what was the design role of the Chester-class cruisers? I've seen them referred to as both light and scout cruisers, and it does get a little bit confusing. They are a bit of a weird one, to be honest, because they have a belt, which in the terminology of the time would make them light armoured cruisers, because they can't be protected cruisers, because protected cruisers just have a protective deck. So with a belt, no matter how thin, the Chesters are technically light armoured cruisers, which would later get shortened to light cruiser. However, their actual design purpose was as a scout cruiser, which, I mean, apart from anything you can tell by looking at their size and armament, they're not the world's biggest ships by a long shot, and they have an armament of 2 heavy-ish guns for their size class, 2 5-inch guns, and a battery of smaller guns, in their case 6 3-inch guns. Now, when you compare that to a Royal Navy scout cruiser that's built around the same time, bearing in mind that the Chesters start construction in 1905, so for the Royal Navy, you're looking at either the Sentinels built just before or the Bodaciers built slightly after. The Sentinels have 10 3-inch guns, and the Bodaciers have 6 4-inch guns. And then if you go forward in time with the Royal Navy, the Blonde class have 10 4-inch guns, the Active class have 10 4-inch guns, and then the Arethusa class, which is kind of the culmination and then move over slightly into being light cruisers, although still doing the scout cruiser role, they have a pair of 6-inch guns and 6 4-inch guns. And then you look at other light cruisers, so the Town class light cruisers that are under construction at that time start off with the first ones, have 2 6-inch guns and 10 4-inch guns. Some of the later ones move towards a all 6-inch armament, and even some of the early C-class cruisers, which are somewhat late, almost a decade after the Chesters, they start out with a pair of 6-inch and 8 4-inch, and then move on to uniform 6-inch armament. So armament-wise and protection-wise, the Chesters do resemble a small light armoured cruiser, but their design purpose was scout cruiser, which was to stay up and forward with the destroyer flotillas, acting as a kind of giant flotilla leader, which is why they have a relatively thin belt, because thin it might be, but it'll keep out destroyer-grade gunfire very well. The only problem is that, well, the US had been building destroyers that were 3 to 5 knots faster than the Chesters for almost a decade by the time the Chesters were built, so with their top speed of 24 knots, and in fact, the Truxtons and Bainbridges were even faster still, 28, 30 knots, there was no chance of the Chesters ever keeping up with the destroyers, and so they ended up playing the role of slightly slower than average light cruisers, albeit some of the later ones were a knot or two faster. But yeah, it's a case of they box themselves into the role of fairly small and uninspired light cruisers by simply failing their speed check. Nathan Ziller asks, during the Guadalcanal campaign, when the Japanese were bombarding the Henderson Field area, was there night air fighting? Would a flight of torpedo or dive bombers from the US coming from the north surprise them, make a difference, or was it even worth trying? Night flying was still something of a specialist skill at the beginning of World War II, and, well, the US was a little behind on it, let's just say that. Carrier-based night flying is a whole other level of difficulty above land-based night flying, but even for the fighters that were and bombers that were based on Henderson Field, flying at night is still very, very risky. Plus, you've got the fact of where are these aircraft going to come from? Because the Americans didn't know the Japanese were going to attack Henderson Field. If they knew the Japanese were going to attack Henderson Field that night, they would have at least got their aircraft up and out of there, or maybe even tried a night strike, or actually tried a day strike on the Japanese ships before they got there. So if Henderson Field is coming under attack, it's not going to be aircraft coming from Henderson Field that are going to attack the Japanese at night, which means you're basically back to carrier aircraft. The carriers tended to stay away from the area at night because of the risk of night attack by Japanese surface ships, but let's assume that maybe at dusk somebody's got a message off, maybe a submarine spots incoming Japanese shipping. That gets over to the US carrier forces, but in the time it takes it to filter down through to getting it over to Henderson Field itself, maybe by that point Henderson Field has come under attack and there's not a precious huge amount they can do about it anyway. Again, we fall back on the problem that US carriers at this stage are not really trained for night strikes at all, so they're probably not going to be able to do anything about it. But assuming that they somehow did, coming out of the north would possibly be the single worst thing they could have done, because if Henderson Field is under attack, shells are exploding, there are ships offshore, everybody's panicking, and then radar or visual spotting sees a bunch of strike aircraft coming in from the north. Well, what's to the north? The Japanese-held territories. they're going to assume that those are Japanese aircraft, and the anti-aircraft defences at Henderson that are active are going to open up in a big way. So, yeah, and coupled with the fact with, those aircraft are probably not going to hit anything in the first place, it's just not worth the trouble. You'd end up losing the vast majority of the aircraft. Even if they never get hit, the chance of them finding their way back to the carriers are pretty slim. Bruce Williams asks, could you comment on the nature of the flight deck surface of USS Yorktown CV-10? Were such previously of wood? Your last photo brought it to mind with her deck looking so smooth. Yeah, now you've got to remember that the SCB modifications, whether that be the SCB-27 or SCB-125 that Yorktown underwent, both of which are well past the period the channel normally covers, so I'm not particularly as well read up on them as perhaps other elements of their earlier histories, that being, the Essexes as a whole. But SCB-27, the first upgrade program, which left them still with straight flight decks, mentions in passing that they were heavily reinforced, that being the flight decks. It doesn't say exactly how they were heavily reinforced, but they were. But I did also find a reference to light metal cladding being placed on the flight decks. And then SCB-125, which is what gave her the angled flight deck, basically built on the structure that SCB-27 had. Oriskany is the only one to have had additional cladding as part of SCB-125, at least as far as I can determine. Again, I'm not a Cold War historian. But what I would surmise from that is that what you're looking at, and certainly what it felt like while I was aboard, is that you have a metal plate cladding across the flight deck, which is obviously part of the reinforcement package that allows the carrier to support aircraft like the ones you can see here, which are considerably heavier than her World War II complement. Now, as for whether that means the wooden flight deck is still there under the metal, I don't know. But I do know a few people who either currently or have worked at USS Yorktown are watching the channel. So if one of you is hearing this and you know the answer, is the wooden flight deck still there under the metal? Let us know in the comments and then we can all know. Rocksteady Champion asks, what will be the result of an engagement between a larger ship of one era, say a top-tier predreadnought battleship, and a smaller but more advanced ship of a later era, say a treaty cruiser? Essentially, it all comes down to fire control, because unless you're moving to a period back before about the mid-1890s, from the 1890s, from say 1895-ish, give or take a year, onwards, large capital ship guns are capable of going a considerable distance, far further, a lot of the time, than they can actually accurately fire, which means that if your theoretical older ship has been updated with modern fire control systems, then it should still have the advantage, because it should still be carrying a superiority of armour, and its guns should be able to match the range of the engagement, unless it's one of these ships that has an elevation that's limited to, say, 10 or 15 degrees, in which case a treaty ship might, like a treaty heavy cruiser, might still be able to win simply by just outranging it, not because the older ship's guns can't reach that far, as a matter of just physics, but as a matter of the elevation limitation means they physically can't reach that far. So if you're talking about, like you said, a top-tier pre-dreadnought, so a Lord Nelson or a Danton or something like that, if they are going up against, say, a County or a New Orleans or something along those lines, if they've been modernised with better elevation and modern fire control, the older ship will win. If they don't have increased elevation, there's a chance the treaty ship can outrange them no matter how good their fire control is, and if their fire control hasn't been updated, they're pretty much stuffed no matter what, because even if they have the increased elevation, they almost certainly won't be able to hit anything at long range. So those are basically the questions you've got to answer in that kind of engagement. And in fact, one example of almost exactly this kind of thing happening in terms of a more advanced ship of a later era but smaller, at least in pecking order, versus older capital vessels, is actually Georges Savarov, hence the picture here. Georges Savarov, by the way, is the one on the left. Because when she faced off against the Ottoman battleships, yes, it was 3 battleships versus 1 armoured cruiser, but the newest of the Ottoman battleships were Brandenburg-class predreadnoughts. They were 17 years older than Averof. And 17 years in the 1890s and 1900s is a lot of technological advancement. The third one that the Ottomans had was Mesudaya, which was an ironclad, an old ironclad that they'd converted to look vaguely like a predreadnought. So, yeah, the less said about that age gap, the better. Next up we have, I know the British, French and Spanish built several large 100-gun ships of the line. Did any other countries build similar large ships? Yes, but usually much, much later than those 3 navies. So, for example, the Russian Navy built quite a number of first rates. However, whilst the British, French and Spanish were building 100-gun ships of the line from kind of the mid-1600s onwards, once you get Sovereign of the Seas and her successors, and by the start of the 1700s, the first rate was well established on all 3 fleets. The Russians, for example, at least as far as I can see, didn't build their first 100-gunner until 1727, and that appears to have been a bit of a one-off, really. Just the one ship. It was then broken up in 1752, which meant that they almost went for a period without a first rate, but they did build another couple in 1748 and 1758, but then they didn't do anything else. Those ships were broken up in 1759 and 1772, respectively, so they then did have, in the latter part of the 1700s, a period without any first rates. Then they built a whole slew of them. They built 9 in the 1780s and getting into 1790. And then once you get into, the 1800s, then all of a sudden building 100-gun and more becomes very fashionable. The Austro-Hungarians and Austrians, at least as far as I know, never quite had a first rate. Even the SMS Kaiser was a 92-gunner, which technically makes it a second rate. The Americans did build 1 first-rate ship of the line, the USS Pennsylvania, which has been gracing your screens for the answer for this question. The Dutch built at least 1 in 1703, the Eendracht, well, one of several Eendrachts that they built, but that one was 100 guns. They built quite a few 90, 94, 96 gunners around that time as well. By the time of the Crimean War in the 1850s, the Ottomans had a handful of first rates as well. So, yeah, there are other nations out there that did build first rates, but when they did, they tended to build relatively few of them. Jennifer Clark asks, what if Franz Ferdinand wasn't actually shot? How would the naval arms race between Germany and Britain develop? Well, as I covered in a video a little while back, the Anglo-German Naval Arms Race was basically already over. The Germans had kind of given up in 1912 when they decided they needed to put more money into their army. After the Königs are laid down at the end of 1911, Germany lays down 1913 and 1914 they planned to lay down a grand total of 4 battleships, the 4 Bayern and Baden in 1913, although just. Sachsen and Württemberg are supposed to be in 1914, but where Württemberg gets pushed just into 1915, but, without the war, probably 1914. So you've got 2 battleships in 1913, 2 battleships in 1914, and, as I said previously, you've got the Königs at the end of 1911, which you'll spot means 0 battleships laid down in 1912. Now, to be fair, you do have Der Flinger and Lützow laid down in 1912 and then Hindenburg in 1913. So you're looking at basically the Germans planning and or actually laying down about just a fraction over 2 capital ships a year, 1912, 1913, 1914. And in fact, the final naval law, the one in 1912, said that they would basically do exactly this. They were supposed to be building a battleship and a battlecruiser every year, with 1 extra in 1913 and 1916, hence the additional ship in 1913. Now compare that with the British in 1912, the entire Iron Duke class of 4 plus Queen Elizabeth and Warspite, and then in 1913, so you've got 6 ships then, plus a 7th HMS Tiger being a battlecruiser, and then you've got Barham, Valiant, Malaya, Revenge, Resolution and Ramillies, so another 6 battleships, no battlecruiser this time, laid down in 1913. Royal Oak and Royal Sovereign laid down in 1914, and of course you would have also had Resistance, Renown, Repulse and Agincourt in 1914 if things had gone on. So that would have been, well, 6 battleships a year plus Tiger back there at the beginning. At which point I think the British are either going to continue that for a bit, or they might step it back down to only building a class of 4, or maybe a class of 4 and a battlecruiser. It depends which designs they choose. If they stick with 21 to 23 knot designs, then they'll probably end up building a 4-ship class and a battlecruiser once they calm down a little and realise they're massively ahead of the Germans. If they go for something a little bit quicker, like a successor to the Queen Elizabeth, they'll probably just do 4 to 6 of them. So yeah, the short answer is the British win. Ibereg asks, recently there's been this factoid going around that the main potato incident never happened, based on repeated claims from the captain of the O-Bannon that not only were no potatoes thrown, but O-Bannon never did get in potato throwing range of RO34 to begin with. However, recently, a history YouTuber by the name of The Fat Electrician chimed in, stating the enlisted men of the O-Bannon claimed that the main potato incident did actually happen, and given his experience in the Marine Corps, he tends to find that the enlisted men are more reliable for stories on the crazy shenanigans ships get up to than the officers. What's your take on the matter? I tend to believe that it did happen for a number of reasons. Firstly, destroyers getting really, really close to enemy submarines is something that happened quite a lot. And secondly, when they did so, they very, very often found that their main guns, and even some of their secondary guns, which on a destroyer are going to be your anti-aircraft weapons and such, usually couldn't actually depress enough to hit their target, because submarines are fairly low-lying. They then found themselves in a bit of a conundrum, because if the submarine crew got to their deck gun, well, the deck gun is near enough almost at water level anyway, and can put rounds at point-blank range into the rather unprotected side of a destroyer, or escort, whatever, destroyer, escort, frigate, corvette, etc., etc. In these circumstances, if the submarine's crew come boiling out of the conning tower, then the surface vessel's crew have a bit of a problem, because they could be coming out to surrender, they could be coming out to fight. You can't really wait until they get to the deck gun, because once they get to that deck gun and they start unloading into you, you're in a lot of problems, which means you have to find some way of dissuading people, if not necessarily from coming up, at least from going towards the deck gun, or deck guns, depending on the size of the sub. And as I said, this situation was not uncommon during the Second World War. When this occurred, therefore, I mean, usually they'd try and open the range a little bit, but in the interim, all sorts of interesting things ended up getting thrown at various submarine crews. Some crew, perhaps being a little bit more practical or a little bit quicker on the draw, would open fire with small arms if they had small arms to hand. But a lot of the crew wouldn't have small arms, because despite it being a warship, you don't generally have your crew walking around packing rifles and pistols and all sorts of things. And so, because the crew on the ship don't want to die, they would start throwing things, and they would throw whatever came to hand, which on a destroyer could be cartridge cases, it could be boxes, it could be empty Coke bottles, not rocks, because you don't usually find that many rocks on a destroyer in the middle of the ocean. Not usually tools, but, basically anything loose, vaguely heavy and able to be hefted would end up being pelted at the submarine crew, usually until either they gave up trying to get to the deck gun, they indicated their surrender, or the ship pulled away far enough that thrown objects weren't going to hit the submarine and the anti-aircraft guns or the main guns could. So, in light of all of that, and everything I've mentioned in terms of stuff that was thrown at them, with obviously the exception of the rocks, that is all absolutely 100% confirmed stuff that was thrown at submarine crews by various surface ship crews in the event that their ships got a little bit too close. And that's not even including yourselves if you decide to do an impromptu boarding action. So the idea that the O-Bannon ended up close enough that it could throw potatoes, and did throw potatoes, is entirely within keeping with World War II incident. Plus, if you look at the layout of a Fletcher-class destroyer, a number of storerooms, the bread locker and the galley are all in the superstructure at the main deck level. So if there's a bunch of crewmen, especially crewmen off of guns and everything, who can't engage a submarine and are desperate to find something to throw, yeah, food storage, like potato storage, is going to be literally right there as a ready source of ammunition. So I'm going to give it to the enlisted men at this point. I think it probably did happen, and there's certainly very little reason to doubt that it didn't. Brian Stevens asks, I understand that military ships often overcrew to make up for things like prize crews and unexpected deaths. In the Age of Sail, did merchant ships do this as well, considering the dangers of sea travel at the time? Yes, but to a much more limited extent. Because, as it turns out, you actually need remarkably few people to run something like an East Indiaman. So, without the necessity to man massive amounts of guns, although some of the bigger East Indiamen were themselves relatively heavily armed, you had two ways of going about it. Either you were one of the big, actually relatively heavily armed East Indiamen, in which case you would have your gun crews basically dual-classed as sailors. So, if you did have an unexpected outbreak of disease that took 3 or 4 men, you could just get men that would normally serve the guns, and then they would become your replacement sailors. And quite often the sailors were also the gunners, just generally speaking. But on a heavily armed East Indiaman, you needed more crew because you needed enough men to at least minimally man the masts and yards whilst also manning the guns. If you were a merchant ship that was much more lightly armed, because bear in mind in the Age of Sail virtually no merchant ship was completely unarmed, then if you were sailing with an absolutely minimal crew, you would still have a little bit of extra built in, because it's not just about casualties, unexpected death and so forth. It's also about things like storms. If you're sailing your ship full of valuable cargo and you hit a storm, you're going to need considerably more people up there aloft and keeping the ship afloat generally than you would if you're just sailing in a nice stiff breeze. So you would at least crew to that minimum, and that in and of itself gives you a bit of a margin against the loss of people in more, and then having to sail the ship in more regular circumstances. Of course, if you happen to lose a number of your crew to unexpected deaths, and then you hit a major storm, you could be in a bit of a problem. But that's why a lot of ships were lost, amongst other reasons. Storms not being the world's best friend to anyone, but especially to wooden sail-powered vessels. But the overhead would be kept to an absolute minimum by the owners of the ship, because, of course, every extra man you have beyond the minimum necessary is somebody that you have to pay. And everybody you have to pay eats into your profits. The flip side of that, of course, being if you pay too few people, the ship will never arrive and you won't make any profit, you'll just make a huge loss. But it's a very fine balance. Gregory Albert asks, how would you make the F2A Buffalo a better aircraft without basically just making it into its subsequent replacements? So bear in mind, I am not an aircraft historian. So this is based partially on what books I have available that cover naval aircraft in extreme detail, particularly Norman Friedman's Carrier Fighters. Definitely recommend you pick that one up. As well as chats I've had over the years with people like Chris from Military Aviation History and more recently Rex from Rex's Hangar. And I think, well, the two main enemies of the F2A Buffalo are Brewster Aircraft Corporation itself, who seem completely useless in producing anything like a decent production run of aircraft on time, and in any considerable numbers. And that obviously limits how quickly you can cycle around to improve versions. But the single biggest problem, at least from what I can see, seems to be the fact that it was just an aircraft that had reached the limits of its performance. The airframe is relatively small. It's a bit smaller in all dimensions, except for couple of inches in height, compared to the F4F, the Wildcat, and it has, in its final form, very high wing loading. I think it's a slightly smaller aircraft that just got overloaded and had a relatively small wing area to start with. So if there was any one change I would make to it, bearing in mind it actually has, at least in the early days, a similar power plant to the F4F. So, it's not lacking necessarily in engine power. I'd give it a new wing or just a slightly bigger wing. That's going to make it more agile and therefore, more capable of sustaining dogfights and able to carry perhaps the additional weight that it's got with it. Other than that, again, not an aircraft historian, I would struggle a little bit to ascertain anything different other than looking in its profile. It just looks less aerodynamic in terms of its fuselage and everything than something like the F4F. But again, you'd be if you're reshaping the fuselage and giving it a new wing, you're effectively making a new aircraft. The only other thing I can possibly think of doing, which would be really radical and slightly odd, but you never know, it might work, would be to replace the engine completely. Scrap the radial engine idea absolutely, and install a Merlin 20, because a Merlin 20 first production's at the beginning of 1940, so you could at least fit them on F2A3s. And yes, it's almost not quite. It's not quite twice as long. It's about 70 to 80% longer than the Wright Cyclone, which is what the Buffalo actually has. But the Wright Cyclone radial is also considerably broader. Not surprising, considering it's a radial compared to an inline engine. And I don't know what exactly that would do to the aircraft's balance characteristics. But in theory, if you stuff a Merlin 20 in there and maybe taper down the nose to fit, you'd end up with another 280-odd brake horsepower, which would probably solve a few problems, I would imagine. The Rogue Chief asks, what was the French reaction to the Battle of Tsushima, given that much of the fleet that had just sunk was either built by them or based on their designs? I haven't read that much about the French reaction specifically, although I would suspect, given some of the issues with the loss of the Russian fleet, obviously the French Navy would have concluded that they probably got a bit better training and probably better ammunition, because France was one of the leading nations when it came to new propellants and ammunition, whereas the Russians had somewhat old style ammunition. But I also suspect that some French ship designers were quietly breathing sighs of relief in terms of their design trends, because if you look at the French battleship predreadnoughts, and I know you have to for this, but when you look at their general design and you look at the Borodinos, the latest Russian battleships that went out there, the Borodinos relatively closely resemble ships like the French Suffren class, for example. Well, Suffren on her own, Suffren and Iéna, maybe a little bit of the Charlemagnes as well, which isn't surprising considering that's the ships they're contemporary with in the late 1890s. But then when you look at the Republique class, it's got a little bit of tumble home, but it's mostly edging away from that. And then you look at the final French true pre-dreadnought class, the Libertés, and the tumble home has been reduced still further. So I would suspect that, given that even the Libertés are well under construction, in fact, Justice and Démocratie are actually both launched by the time Tsushima happens. The Marine Nationale is probably going, thank goodness we've moved away from some of those design principles that turn out to not necessarily work quite as well as we thought they would. And to be perfectly fair, despite the fact that a lot of the more modern Russian fleet was sunk, they took a heck of a battering to make them actually go down. Okay, combat ineffectiveness came a bit sooner, but they didn't go down easily, which probably sat fairly well with the French as well. Owen Woodall asks, after watching the video about the Dutch submarines, I'm curious to know how many Royal Navy submarines operated in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, and how much tonnage they sank. So this is a rather difficult one, because obviously a lot of Royal Navy subs operated both in Mediterranean and European waters and in the Pacific. The weird thing is, in 1939, the single largest concentration of Royal Navy submarines was in the Pacific. That was then all drawn west for the European conflict, leaving none when the war with Japan broke out. And then there were a couple of British subs, 2T class, that came back in 1942, did a few patrols, sort of showing the flag, etc. Then, as the war in Europe started to ease off navally, then more submarine flotillas were transferred back in, but for a long time, to avoid friendly fire, they were restricted to what was termed the British area of operations. So you had essentially Nimitz's area of operations, you had MacArthur's area of operations, and then to the west of that you had the British area of operations. Shockingly, there weren't a tremendous amount of Japanese ships in the Indian Ocean by 1943, 1944, but as time went on, various British flotillas went further east to operate out of Australia and so forth in a more forward offensive role. Various figures I've got from various books cite something between 40 and 50 different submarines operating in the Pacific, or others suggest a force of up to 40 or 50 submarines was present in the Pacific at the end of the war. One of those has to be wrong. If it's 40 to 50 total, then it'd be very surprising if there were also happened to be 40 to 50 at the end of the war. If it's 40 to 50 at the end of the war, then that would suggest that considerably more than that served at any given time. Obviously not all at once, but in total. However, one thing that the various sources I've read do agree on is that working out the tonnage sunk is actually quite difficult because of the operational use of Royal Navy and, to a certain extent in the latter part of the conflict, Dutch submarines. And that's because, there is a tonnage figure, but the tonnage figure and the number of vessels is credited as vessels over 500 tons. And one of the primary ways that the British and, as I said, also Dutch subs were used by the Allies in the mid to late sections of the Pacific War was in shallower waters, because the British subs and the Dutch subs were smaller, as the rule goes, than the American fleet subs. So American fleet subs could struggle in shallow water. They referred to things of like the 10-fathom line. A US sub didn't really want to go inside the 10-fathom line. British and Dutch subs would quite happily go inside that. And that's in terms of the depth of water they could operate in. Or they had to operate in, because below that's the seabed. Now, what this means is that the Dutch and British subs did an awful lot of coastal work, and an awful lot of coastal work with deck guns as well as torpedoes means that they sank a lot of small craft, but a lot of those vessels, obviously, their tonnage is less than 500 tons, which means it's not going to get credited in the official overall entries, at least as far as the 3 or 4 different sources I looked up for this question are concerned, which means arriving at a sum total of exactly how many ships and how much tonnage they sank is almost impossible to do easily. It would either require someone to sit down and go through the war patrols for every single sub and total up roughly what they sank, including all the small stuff, and hope that the assessments of tonnage are correct there, because let's say if you see a fishing boat that's 50 tons and it gets sunk by a deck gun, well, do you know it's a 50-ton fishing boat? Do you record it as a 30-ton fishing boat? Do you record it as an 80-ton fishing boat? Who knows? And if you constantly underestimate, then that's going to throw the estimates out. If you constantly overestimate, that's also going to throw the estimates out. So yeah, unfortunately, unless somebody in a source I haven't looked at in detail has already done that, I could give you the figure of over 500-ton ships sunk, but it would be somewhat misleading and make the British and Dutch efforts look a lot poorer than they actually were. Farragut's Froggut Forger Foraging for 4 Forgotten Frogguts for 4 Froggut Friar Fair. Yeah, okay. Asks, when did clenched nails become popular in ship designs and why? Honestly, I couldn't necessarily point you to a precise date. And for those of you who are wondering what a clenched nail is, this exhibit's a good example. A clenched nail, you hammer the nail through your 2 planks of wood, and then you hammer over the end. Or in an alternate version, as you see on the right, you can hammer a nail through, clip it, and then flatten the tip out kind of like a rivet with this kind of washer that you've put over it, so essentially turning the nail into a sort of rivet. But in any case, clenched nails seem, at least as far as I can see, to go back pretty much about as far as when people were nailing ships together. Now, ancient building techniques used mortise, tenon, and dowel, so all wood construction essentially, with their planks. But Viking longships, or dragon ships, whatever you want to call them, they seem to have been using clenched nails. And I would suspect that it's pretty much almost a complete given, if you're using straight nails like this, as opposed to modern boat nails, to have to clench your nails, because if you don't, then the stresses that are working at a ship as it goes through the water are probably going to loosen and then pull out your nails rather quickly, unless you hammer over the end or flatten the end to form some form of resistance against them being pulled out. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, "You've opined that British carrier doctrine went in the wrong direction following World War II. I share your opinion, but always believe that the wrong turn started with the Colossus class. Whilst there are a dozen things I don't like about the class, the worst part of it is that my belief that Implacable represented the pinnacle of World War II carrier design and is my favourite carrier of World War II. Do you think the British would have been better off trying to build one or two more Implacables whilst nixing the Colossus class?" Well, judging build times is a little bit difficult because the Implacables were delayed repeatedly during the Second World War, sometimes just by diversion of effort to escorts and sometimes just by lack of skilled labour, to which my solution would have been, well, recruit and train more people then, it's wartime. Got to maintain those profit margins, I guess. In any case, when you look at the thing is, when you look at the build times of the Light Fleet Carrier program, the Colossuses and the Majestics, they're not actually all that much shorter than the build times of the Illustrious class immediately before the war. So, whilst in theory they are being built fractionally faster, and I understand the rationale for the Light Fleet Carrier program. They are cheaper, and that means because of their size and cheapness, you can build a lot of them very quickly, relatively speaking, which means you can suddenly have loads of carriers present had the war gone on into 1946. But one of the big problems the British had was the Light Fleet Carrier programs and its descendants were all designed to basically be, out of service almost quicker than they'd been built. They were designed to last a few years. Essentially, they were Japan War only carriers, and then they'd go away and presumably be replaced by something bigger. And I think one of the major problems was then the war ended just as all of these things were being churned out, and their successors like the Centaurs, etc. And suddenly there was no war, so you had a bunch of brand new carriers. So of course the temptation was, well, we built all these things, and now, whereas in wartime you can go, right, this is going to be, that's it, all done. In peacetime, if you've just built a bunch of new ships, it's very difficult to justify getting rid of them very quickly. And there were some limitations to the design of the Implacables, like the hangar heights, which did make things a bit problematic going forward. However, with all that said, especially with hindsight, but perhaps even at the time, my personal solution, both to making the Implacable class quicker and easier to build and getting more of them out instead of the Colossuses, would have been to take some inspiration from actually what they planned to do to modernise the Implacables in the early 50s, and instead of going with double height hangars, and in the end, well, 1.5 hangars, and fully enclosed hangars, plus the armoured flight deck, I would have gone, okay, let's apply our early wartime lessons, and some of the lessons we've learned from the Americans with the victorious cooperating the Saratoga Exchange Program, and start building Implacable Mark IIs, whatever we want to call them, in, mid-42. So what I would do is take the Implacable class hull, but give it a partially open hangar design rather than fully enclosed. There's lots of advantages to that, which were agreed upon by pretty much everybody. So adopt that element from the American design. And then cribbing slightly forward from the early 50s refit plans, but also just generally sensibly. Once you've got an open or semi-open hangar deck, instead of having double hangars, where both hangars end up being quite small and in terms of height and not able to fit some of the later aircraft, combine it all through into one large hangar. Now that simplifies a lot of things, apart from anything else. You don't have to build a whole additional deck inside the ship, and the accommodation issue is solved, because originally they were supposed to have 2 full-length hangars. The accommodation issue on the original Implacable designs was solved by making the lower deck half-length. Well, in this case, put, say, 10 feet into your lower deck, your accommodation deck, so you can get some nice, maybe triple-stacked bunks or something, or at the very least, fairly generous, but maybe even 9-foot deck, whatever. And then that means you can get a 20-foot hangar, 20-foot high hangar as your single hangar, which is going to give you huge amounts of redundancy going forwards. You can store all sorts of nice large aircraft, and if you've got an open or semi-open hangar deck design, it's also going to become substantially wider. And with all that weight saving, the ship's going to be very nice and stable. Now, its dimensions are probably still going to be roughly along the lines of Implacable, so it's probably not going to have quite the same aircraft storage capacity as an Essex class, but it's only going to be, 2 or 3 aircraft off, I think, especially with a deck park. And with that massively tall hangar, you can operate future aircraft quite easily. And with the armoured flight deck, you got a nice strong flight deck as well. And then, when you rolled forward into the post-war period, you could go, okay, well, maybe now we don't need the armoured flight deck, so let's thin it out, because you still need to strengthen the flight deck to handle the new incoming jet aircraft and so forth. So instead of having 3 inches of armour over 70-80% of it, why don't you go, okay, well, we'll have 2 inches of steel, 2-inch thick steel flight deck, and that'll run the full length of the flight deck. That'll be nice and strong. You've got your 20-foot hangar beneath to hold all sorts of really big jet aircraft, and you can probably even add a little bit more up top as well if you need to, in terms of thicker flight deck, because you've saved so much weight with just having your one big open hangar. And that wraps up this week's Drydock, everybody. If you are listening to this in regular release, that means I did make it back from the States and I am still alive, so woo, go me. If you're only listening to this on Patreon and wondering why it's not been released publicly, it means I probably fell out of the sky in a fireball or something equally dramatic, I hope. Because, if you're going to die overseas, at least make it dramatic. But hopefully I haven't, and we'll see you all again in another video soon. Bye!